Welcome back. I'm Shane, and this is Relative Time. And today we're going to take a look at a watch that is long overdue for a review. Although it's not one that anyone ever requested, but one I've just had my eye on, as I'm curious just to see how good it is. Now, there are no shortage of dive watch reviews out there, but the vast majority of which are automatics, which is fine for watch enthusiasts and watch collectors that are out there. But if you're just a regular person, then quartz really is the way to go. And since my first diver was the now discontinued NY004, I've always wondered just how good Citizen Solar Eco-Drive divers are. So today we're going to look at their entry-level BN0151. Usually these run about $200, but every once in a while they go on sale, and I think the lowest I've ever seen it is about $120. And that's actually where I picked this one up off of Amazon. And for that, I think you're getting a heck of a lot for your money. But let's dive in and find out. So let's get the specs out of the way on this one. Now, width is 43 millimeters wide without and 44 millimeters wide with the crown, whereas lug to lug is just under 48. So I think it is a little on the wider side of things. And that's pretty clear just when you look at it. There's just a whole lot of bezel and case here after the edge of the dial. And I think that makes the dial look a little small in comparison to some other watches. The case shape itself is also pretty interesting here. It's fairly round with just short stubby lugs coming out. And it kind of reminds me of a flattened Seiko bottle cap, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it is a pretty cool watch. And this is fairly thin compared to a lot of automatics out there, sitting right at 10.3. But as quartz watches go, I think this is a little on the chunkier side. Yet you would expect some thickness with an ISO rated diver. And you can tell that it's an ISO rated diver just by looking at the bottom of the dial, where it says divers 200 meters. If it was just a regular diver, it would just say 200 meters. And if you're not familiar with all that, it just means that it's put through a more rigorous testing process than a standard dive watch. And therefore you can have more faith in it when you actually put it in the water. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but for some people it is. And at this price point, having an ISO rated diver is becoming rarer and rarer. Now, for a quartz watch, this also has a fairly solid and well-made feel to it in the hand, and I think it sits right around 92 grams. But I have to say that on its stock strap, it can feel a little top-heavy, unless you really cinch it down. And even though it's a little wider than I'd prefer, I think that 48mm lug-to-lug keeps it square on my 7-inch wrist, and overall fairly comfortable throughout the day. While the case design may be pretty simple, the finish itself is pretty good for the price. It's almost entirely brushed, and it has a really smooth feel to it. You can see the linear brushing marks on the side, but it almost has a sandblasted feel to it. The only exception to all of this is the polished screw-down case back on the back, and just how it's positioned and how it looks, I think it looks a little bit awkward and out of place here. But since it's something you never really see, it's not a big deal. And I think it's important and worth pointing out that since this is a solar-powered watch, you may never have a good reason to take this case back off. And for a dive watch, that's a really good thing, as every time you unscrew or screw this thing back in, you'll put additional wear on the waterproofing seals. The crown here is at the 4 o'clock position, and it's nestled nicely inside 2 small crown guards. It is signed and it is screwed down, as you would expect with a good diver. But it's also fairly small and kind of hard to get a grip on and unscrew. Now, if this was an automatic, this would be a bigger deal, but since it's quartz, you should only have to mess with it a few times a year. And as you might expect at this price, you do have mineral crystal covering the dial. A sapphire crystal with more scratch resistance would be really nice here, but kinda unrealistic to expect that from Citizen at this price point. Now, that said, the crystal is very nice and very clear, and with the matte textured dial, you're not going to have any reflective or glare issues with this watch. The bezel is a stainless steel to match the case, and here it has a blue aluminum insert. Although, for whatever reason, Citizen has used a 60-click bezel as opposed to the 120-click bezels that are becoming much more common. Yet it's still unidirectional and has a pretty good action, with a nice crisp sound and tactile response. However, the bezel is a bit hard to get a hold of and use. While that buttery smooth finish is great for the case, it's not so good when it comes to getting traction to turn the bezel. And since the bezel isn't very tall and it doesn't stick out beyond the case, even the grooves here don't really help you get a good grip. Now, as dive watches go, the case design here is a little different, and it is fairly simple. There's no chamfered edges or extra frills anywhere on this thing, yet it feels very sturdy and very durable, and has a fairly good and just straight to the point design. And just like an SKX, this one is more of a pure tool watch, one that's more about function than flash. Which is also something you can see in the dial, as it's a non-reflective flat matte finish. And here it is blue that does match the bezel. Overall, it's not the most striking dial I've seen, but one thing I will say is that I appreciate that you can tell that it's a blue dial. One of my complaints with my older blue NY004 was that unless you had direct light on it, it was pretty hard to tell that it was blue. Most of the time it just looked black. And just like that old Citizen, the dial design is fairly similar, as you have applied indices that are mostly dots, as well as these wedge-shaped things at the cardinal points. And all the indices have a rather reflective polished frame to them, and that is then filled with white lume. The indices aren't very tall, so this is not a watch with a whole lot of depth. But I think thanks to the reflective framing on the indices and just how they play with the light, there is a little bit more of an illusion of depth thanks to that. Now, beyond the indices, you have a raised chapter ring, and one that extends upwards towards the crystal. This is something that's fairly common with a lot of Seikos. And just like a lot of Seikos, this one isn't perfectly lined up. It's fairly close, but you can tell by looking down at the 6. And since it is close, it's not really a huge deal. But if you're one that's really OCD about perfection, even in a watch at this price, this might be one you want to see in person rather than just order online. And that goes for the second hand as well, as that one is a whole lot more off, and I know for some people that's really what drives them crazy about quartz watches. Now, every watch is going to be different, and everyone's going to have a little bit better or worse alignment. It's really hard to tell, so again, if you're really OCD about this stuff, try to see one in person first. The handset here is a little different compared to other brands, but it's fairly common with Citizen. It's sort of their more geometric take on a Plow-Prof handset, where you have a shorter, stubbier hour hand that's then paired with a colorful and longer minute. And the idea behind that is that when you're actually diving, the minute hand and its relation to the bezel are the most important thing. So those are the things that you want to stand out the most. Now, even though that's not my favorite type of handset, and I think as a whole all the hands here look a little bit short, I gotta say they are rather easy to read, and I think they do look good with the design of the indices. There is a date at the 4, and that is one that breaks up one of the hour indicators, but I think they did a good job putting a white frame around it, as it really blends into the overall design. Although having a custom blue date wheel and having one where the date is rotated so that it's straight up would be better here, but at this price there are always compromises, and you never quite get everything you want. Now, if you're not familiar with the channel or how I review things, you're probably thinking I'm really being nitpicky here. And I kinda am, but I'm not doing it to say that this watch is particularly bad, but really to point out everything I see so that you have a good idea what to expect. And in this case, and as a whole, I actually really like this watch for what it is. It's a very appealing and straightforward design, which is then combined with a sturdy and well-made case, as well as a maintenance-free solar movement. And you throw all of that together, and it creates an ideal grab-and-go watch. One that should be ready for whatever you're going to throw at it. It also has really killer lume, and maybe the best lume I've seen at this price. Citizen decided to use a blue lume, and I really love how these indices look with it, and especially that odd-shaped 12. And interestingly here, they left the pip on the bezel as green, and I think that helps it stand out more, and not something you typically see. But more important when it comes to lume is that this one really has staying power, as it's easily able to outlast a Seiko turtle that costs twice as much. And for a long while, it actually holds its own against an Orient Star diver, which is the watch I thought had the best lume from last year. So for the price, and especially if you get this one on sale, the lume is absolutely fantastic. Now, as I've said a few times, this is an Eco-Drive quartz movement, which is just Citizen's way of saying it's a solar-powered movement. And it's able to absorb light not just from the sun, but also light bulbs indoors. And once fully charged, it should be able to run for about 6 months in complete darkness. These days, the movements are fairly robust, and Citizen says they should last at least 20 years. So the odds are that this is a watch you'll never have to do anything with, and you'll be ready for a replacement before anything goes wrong. Now, as far as the strap goes, it's okay. It's actually pretty good for a rubber strap. The only issue I really have with it is that it's a bit stiff, but I'm really just not a fan of it. Partly because I just prefer more interesting strap combinations. But the biggest issue I have with it is the dive table on the side. Most people don't know what this is and don't really care about it. And as a whole, I think it just distracts from an otherwise attractive look, as the blue of the strap matches the bezel and the dial nicely. If you're talking quartz divers, I think the best value watch out there is going to be a Casio Duro. It just has a ridiculously low price. But I think this one is pretty close. And here you are getting a solar-powered movement as well as an ISO-rated diver. And that should give you confidence if you ever happen to go in the water. And I think the only other company doing this is going to be Seiko. Yet the Seiko solar divers I've seen are at least $100 more. So this Citizen is going to be hard to beat. Now, it's not perfect, and I have a hard time seeing watch collectors and watch enthusiasts ever truly being won over by this one, as there are so many automatic options out there, and this one will just get lost in the shuffle. But if someone's looking for an affordable quartz diver, either for themselves or as a gift, just something you put on and go and never need to worry about, the Citizen Promaster is ideal. It's a clean, simple, and attractive design. It's not flashy, but it's not boring either. And while the strap is just okay, you can see how much the look can change just by swapping it to a new one. But more to the point, this is a full-fledged diver, and one with great lume. And at this price, there's only a handful of other watches that could say that. And most of those aren't solar. So, in some ways, this is in a league of its own. But that's my take on the Citizen Promaster Eco-Drive Diver, and let me know yours down below. And if you can think of any other Citizens I should take a look at, mention that as well. I just don't look at them near enough. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.